On the 21st of April 2016, a Reddit user made a thread in the Black Ops subreddit asking, why would there be 30-ish Wi-Fi networks seemingly emanating from under a concrete pad? The user went on to state that he had recently lived on a semi-urban farm property for a few months in Hawaii. He had noticed a few unusual things that he didn't decide to reveal. However, one thing that stood out the most was the fact that there were about 25 to 30 low-strength Wi-Fi networks somewhere in the neighborhood. In hindsight, it may seem normal to have a number of networks that are available, but what made the situation weird was that it was all exactly the same strength peaking at the same point location, and it seemed to be originating from underneath a concrete pad, which was made to simply cover gravel and dirt. The user then had the idea to utilize a Wi-Fi analyzer just to be sure that it wasn't some sort of coincidence where maybe numerous neighborhood networks somehow happen to have similar signal strength based on the distances they were from their sources. He also stated that he walked in circles while operating the Wi-Fi analyzer, and as he walked further from the point location on the concrete pad, the weaker the signal became. If that wasn't weird enough, another peculiar fact was that these network SSIDs would change every 5 minutes or so. In an effort to further uncover the mystery, he used a thermal imaging device to detect any hotspots on the ground.
Have you heard the claim that Social Security is going to go bankrupt?
Yes.
And do you know why Social Security is not bankrupt today?
He then decided to drill directly on top of a spot that was notably hotter compared to other areas on the concrete pad, along with a number of other holes as a form of control. This was then followed by filling them with water. To his surprise, only the hole that was directly on top of the hotspot drained the water, and the others overflowed. Later on that same day, he was asked by other Redditors if there were any indications of a power source nearby. He answered by reporting that there were power lines, however they were disconnected from the city's main grid, and that there was a very wealthy neighbor who owns a steel frame building where the power cables go. He also states that the whole mountain area was being used by the military during World War II. This being the case, there are no reported military bases in the mentioned position, according to the militarybases.com website, though the user had mentioned that he had no doubt there are underground facilities there. While in the same comment thread, he asked two other Redditors for their opinion on the heat signatures. One of them replied by asking for photos of the surrounding area. The user then provided photos that sparked even more suspicion. These included a multi-breaker setup where the lower conduit runs under asphalt and toward the peak signal point location, with a corresponding hotspot, the hole that fills up with water, and a bucket found on the property, which he said reminded him of the hydroxide body disposal scene from the TV show Breaking Bad. The user was also asked if there was any way to measure the thickness of the concrete pad, because if the heat was coming from below, you would expect it to dissipate, not stay as focused as it seemed. In response, the user posted a photo showing that the concrete pad was about 2 times the thickness of the surrounding area. He also stated that it was extremely hard and seemed to have river rocks mixed in, whereas the surrounding area didn't and was easy to drill through with a hammer drill and masonry bit. As the user tried his best to drill into the pad, he managed to get to approximately 2 feet away from the hotspot location. According to him, the heat was unbearable there. He compared it to the inside of a composting bin, but there were no signs of microbial activity. He also noted that the soil was red volcanic dirt, which shouldn't have any biological activity anyway. Unfortunately, this is where the comment chain ends. However, there were other developments to this mysterious story. The user was then met with another question. He was asked if he could connect to any of the access points or gain control of the devices so he could identify a manufacturer. He was also asked whether the power meter was moving significantly, which would indicate it was powering multiple devices, and if there were any heat vents nearby. He replied that it was possible, however he couldn't crack the passwords. He didn't mention anything about the power meter, but he did send a picture of the general area where he suspected the heat vents could be hiding. In the same thread, it was also noted that the building seen in the picture had been partially built by questionable contractors. It was also mentioned that large liquid tanks had been removed from the ground there, meaning there had to be a lot of underground space available. At the same time, a nearby municipal storm drain was recently removed, and a newer, significantly bigger one was built directly opposite the property line, which he believed could serve as an entrance to an underground area of some sort. Additionally, there were 2 important factors the user shared. Firstly, he said that on multiple occasions he saw a truck making late-night trips to move a lot of busted-up, new-looking concrete from the trash bins of the neighbors. Secondly, and arguably the most important detail, he connected his old boss's account to an eBay seller going by the name of Cheesy Bay, which had extremely suspicious reviews and feedback. In a twist of events, the feedback and reviews were then set to private, which implied that the owner found out about his discovery. When asked about this, the user stated that he was in a, quote, pretty good spot, and that they wouldn't get him easily. So this is where the thread ends, but the mystery continues on. The mentioned eBay account was known to sell strange items such as faulty hard drives and other faulty electronics. Other than people looking to restore broken devices, who would actually think to buy faulty hard drives? This story takes an even crazier dive because that eBay account is where everything got linked to Pizzagate, a conspiracy theory that went viral during the 2016 United States presidential election cycle. The theory claimed that the New York City Police Department had discovered a pedophilia ring linked to members of the Democratic Party while searching through Anthony Weiner's emails. In the end, there is no real ending to this mystery. It was later reported that the original user allegedly had mental issues. This is supported by the fact that the user's old boss had actually commented and provided details about him, including the fact that he ripped off his ceiling fan because he believed he was being watched. He also claimed that there were no real connections as to why the user would suddenly intrude and link his boss's account to the eBay seller. Of course, the boss could be lying, because nearly everything discussed in the story had some form of evidence attached to it. Nevertheless, this mystery will remain unsolved.
This week, show your love while staying on budget at Grocery Outlet, your extreme value.
On Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, a Redditor posted in the home maintenance subreddit something that was eye-catching enough for moderators to delete it within the hour. The post was recovered by a viewer and sent to me on December 23rd. The post states, "I have cut myself pretty badly in my rented apartment. Fortunately, everything is alright, but I don't really want to notify the owners of damage on the walls. What would I need to make this disappear?" You don't have to look at the picture for long to realize this is a very oddly shaped and placed blood splatter. The original poster was very vague about how exactly he cut himself. It would have had to have been a pretty graphic accidental slice of a knife to lead to a blood splatter like that on the wall. There is a noticeable chip in the wall right in the center of the thickest part of the blood splatter, which would imply the blood wasn't sprayed on the wall, but rather the blood on the wall was the result of something hitting the wall. What makes this post more unsettling and suspicious is that the user is known to post in the alcoholism subreddit, stating he gets drunk on average 5 days a week. But according to one of his other posts that was made just a month before this one, his girlfriend had cheated on him and left him due to his drinking, and she left him right before the ring he ordered had arrived. The viewer who sent this to me reported this in the RBI subreddit, which stands for Reddit Bureau of Investigation, which led to the poster blocking him, even though he never directly contacted him. So, I'm sure I don't have to explain where I'm going with this, but whether this could have been a deleted post that was in reality a man secretly trying to cover up something horrible that happened in his apartment involving his cheating ex-girlfriend, or simply just a very unfortunate coincidence, for now remains a mystery. It's not uncommon to hear cases about squatters living illegally in other people's houses without their knowledge. This is the story of a Reddit user named Random Girl to You, and it happened in 2016. She was coexisting with an individual who she actually knew, but would never have expected to be the intruder. Understandably, she didn't share a lot of information, but enough was said to show just how creepy her situation was. The whole ordeal was posted in the form of updates over time, meaning she was actively finding evidence in the form of random objects around her house, particularly in the attic. Now, up to this point, it may seem like any other story about a typical squatter living illegally in someone else's home. I've even covered stories about squatters in people's attics before, but what transpired while he was there is more terrifying than any of those other stories I've covered. The user started her story by mentioning that she lived in a fairly large house. In her bedroom, there was a door that led outside to a small porch. She went about her day like she normally would, sweeping the ebony-stained wood floors, something she did often because the material showed even the smallest speck of dirt or dust. She continued her usual routine when suddenly she stumbled upon a tooth sitting right in front of the door on the bedroom floor. Judging by her almost OCD nature, it seemed like the tooth had just recently appeared. She said it had not been there at any moment earlier in the day. She was so shocked that she stood frozen, trying to recall if she had accidentally hit her head and forgotten about it, or if she had been experiencing a toothache and didn't notice one falling out. Still confused, she stood there running her tongue along her teeth to confirm it wasn't hers. After discussing the situation with other users online, the topic of a squatter living in her home surfaced. As reluctant as anyone would be, she finally accepted the possibility, especially because she had already noticed a number of odd things happening in her house, such as missing items, random objects being out of place, and other strange instances that might normally seem trivial but still raised an eyebrow. Living alone has its ups and downs, but in a situation like this, it's never a good idea to investigate a potentially hostile individual in your own living space. But being that as it may, the user replied that it would take too long to wait on anyone, so she went to investigate alone. What she found was only the beginning of a nightmare. It started with finding a smudge in the opening of the attic. Still worried about her safety, she decided to take it slow. She sat and waited to see if there would be any signs of life. She lost track of time sitting in silence, listening for any sound or movement, but all she got was the pure silence that had been accompanying her the entire time. The following days were filled with updates about her findings, and the more she looked, the creepier it got. Because she wasn't very tall, she could only peek slightly past the attic opening. Luck was on her side. A quick scan of the attic layout showed that there were objects laid about, but no visible sign of a person. Still disturbed by the thought that she might not be living alone, she decided to get a taller ladder and a better flashlight. That kind of bravery motivated other users to keep urging her to get to the bottom of the mystery. And it makes sense. She worked in enforcement for Game and Fish Commission, and she was trained. But even she admitted she was a smallish woman living in the middle of nowhere. In the next update, the user confirmed that someone had been living in her attic, matching both her suspicions and the suspicion of other users. But the intruder was not present at the time. Some of the items she found were 8 beer koozies, some of her own personal belongings, a pile of change, and a $20 bill. At first glance, those items might seem harmless, but it gets worse from there. As time went on, law enforcement eventually got involved to help locate the squatter and remove him from the property. Usual procedures were carried out, such as objects being dusted, prints being taken, and items being located. She began to calm down as she realized she wasn't alone in this anymore. In due time, she was told that someone had been visiting her attic for a very, very long time. After hearing that, she made it a point to start locking her doors and even installed new locks just to take an extra step for safety. Unlike most squatter stories, this one was especially unique because the intruder only visited the attic when the user was home. The case was later considered a stalker case based on the behavior and items found. Some might ask why weren't her doors locked in the first place? Well, her response to this exact thing was she didn't lock her doors unless she was sleeping. She lived in a small community of about 400 people, so it was a very slow, quiet lifestyle there. She also said she wasn't worried about robbers because if someone really wanted to break in, a locked door wouldn't stop them. But what she couldn't understand was the tooth. It didn't make sense because it wasn't even on the path that led to the attic, and if it wasn't for one top comment, she would never have thought to check the attic in the first place. The user knew the sheriff well, which is expected in such a small community, and that made things even worse because she started to feel like it could be someone who knew her personally. A quick update later revealed that she was receiving unsolicited, explicit photos while all of this was happening. It was never confirmed who sent them. The user eventually went through the safe where evidence was kept, and what she found was pretty disgusting and horrifying. There were 2 giant pickle jars that the intruder had been using to collect his semen. Among other things, there were thousands of tissues, maroon socks, towelettes, and more items of the same nature scattered around. On top of that, there were also the user's clothes that had been missing for over a year, including underwear. That alone puts into perspective how long the creep had been doing this, moving in and out undetected and carrying out his acts while she was completely oblivious. There were also strange items like a plastic butterfly, a bobblehead wooden turtle, more beer koozies, and black and pink straps with Velcro on the ends. Very weird, questionable things to possess in someone's attic. Sometime later, the user received a call that was supposed to put her mind at ease, that should have answered all questions, that the perpetrator was caught and the nightmare was over. But instead, the identity of the intruder would haunt her for the rest of her life. It turned out to be the 70-year-old neighbor, married to the same woman for countless years, who happened to be a church deacon, father of 4, and grandfather of 6. This one's perhaps one of the more uncomfortable ones to keep your doors locked at all times of the day. There's no additional information regarding an arrest or updates on the old man. This one is perhaps one of the more uncomfortable reminders to simply lock your doors. Maybe the easiest and most obvious preventative measure you can take. This final story comes from a Reddit post in the famous subreddit called Let's Not Meet, and the original poster's account has since been deleted for good reason. From what we can gather, the story suggests the poster was an adolescent male from North Wales, UK, a place known for its beauty and natural landscapes. However, being in the countryside, there isn't much to do, and as teenagers, curiosity is a dangerous fuel. Teens will always want to explore, but when the daily routine mostly involves herding animals, harvesting crops, picking fruit, and similar activities, it's only a matter of time before a teenager snaps. So, out of boredom, the user and a few friends often found themselves wandering the countryside and coastline. Despite the area being sparsely populated, there was a road with 2 separate carriageways running right along the coast from Wales to England. There were also train tracks that ran alongside it for most of the way, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. One night a few years ago, the user and 3 friends decided to explore one of the bridges where the train passed overhead. When they reached it, they noticed a manhole cover nearby. Upon closer inspection, they believed it led to some kind of access room. Intrigued, they tried to pry it open, but without tools, they couldn't. So they returned the following night prepared. Unbolting the cover wasn't easy. They had to work quietly because the train tracks were right next to them. Not close enough to endanger them, but close enough that the train conductors could spot them and raise alarms, which would likely mean the police. Surprisingly, it didn't take long. They lifted the heavy steel disc and wasted no time climbing down the ladder, not knowing where it led or what could be waiting below. Once they reached the bottom, they moved deeper into the structure. At this point, they were completely confined inside a narrow passage leading into the main area. They were perplexed by what they found. They had always assumed it was just a bridge, and if they hadn't found the manhole, they never would have guessed there was an interior space at all. The group endured a torturous journey, squeezing and crouching through whatever space they could find. They scraped their stomachs against the walls as claustrophobia slowly crept up on them. The distance from end to end was far longer than expected, but at the halfway point, they were able to look through narrow gaps in the ground and see the road below them, which strangely gave them a sense of comfort. At that moment, it was still just an adventure. It was uncomfortable and cramped, but it was manageable. But that was about to change. Just before passing the halfway mark, one of his friends claimed he could see something in the distance at the far end. Hesitant but curious, they all agreed to check it out. That turned out to be a terrible decision. The user was the first to reach the end of the walkway. He stated that the dread he felt in the moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. There was a single foldable chair facing a wall, and on that wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper or magazine, showing a fully nude woman in an erotic pose. But he even said he couldn't refer to it as a normal erotic picture, because the woman's eyes had been removed from the page as if someone took a knife to them. Below the picture on the wall, there was a bloody condom on the floor, and when they saw this, the boys left as fast as humanly possible, desperate not to run into whoever was responsible for what they had just stumbled into, which almost seemed like a crime scene to them. When they reached the ladder, every one of them silently prayed the manhole hadn't been resealed. They wouldn't know until they reached the top, but luckily it was still open. The reason the user mentioned the population earlier was because what they had witnessed was completely out of the norm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where anything weird going on would be hard to fly under the radar for long. In the end, being a naive teenage boy, the user never told a single soul what they found, but he admitted later that it would have been wiser to report it, because it was clearly not the behavior of a healthy-minded person. The story ends there, but the user did post updates about returning to the location multiple times, hoping to have something to update with. Eventually, he stopped because the investigation wasn't going anywhere, and it was better to stay alive than to risk his own life.
This week, find everything you need for Valentine's Day at Grocery Outlet, your extreme value.
A couple years ago, I was working as a Lyft driver. Uber as well, but in my town, Lyft was more popular, so that's what I stuck with. Anyway, because of the freedom of the job, I never managed to get myself to follow a schedule. At the time, I was in my mid-20s, and sometimes stayed up late hanging out with friends, or doing whatever. So it would cause me to stay up late on the days I'd choose to work, and do long shifts overnight. This night started just the same as any other. I started around 11ish and did a couple of drop-offs before getting another pickup to do. Now, working these late shifts, I couldn't be picky at all with who or what requests I accept. I was usually one of the only drivers working that late, and there were also usually barely any people needing rides. If I were to miss out or not accept a single ride, it would cost me. So I was kind of on autopilot. Every time a request would come through, I'd instantly accept it and start heading there. And only then would I look a bit more into it, like how far they were or where I was dropping them off at. It never made any difference, because 99% of the time, it was just to pick up someone from a party, a bar, or an office after working past the train hours. So when this request came in, I did the same as always, accepting it and heading en route to their pickup location. It wasn't until I'd say about 10 minutes into the drive that I realized it was taking me in a different direction than usual. Not toward the main town square, with all the stores and offices and whatever. So I checked where exactly I was going, and the location was a little unusual. Of course, I was driving, so I couldn't look too into it, but from a few quick glances at the map, it didn't really look like anything was out there. I thought it was definitely strange, but I wasn't going to cancel or anything. I arrived there 15 minutes later. I think it was about 1 or 2 a.m. by this point in my shift, and the place was just what it looked like on the map. Just a very isolated location with literally nothing. No houses, side roads, trails, or paths. I was thinking maybe the guy's car had broken down or something, but even then, I didn't see anything or anyone. I pulled off the side of the road and notified the customer, then waited a while. I never got a response or saw anyone outside, and with a bad feeling starting to build up in me, I decided to cancel it and drive away. Definitely sucked wasting my time like that, but it is what it is, just part of the job sometimes. I began driving back toward the center of town, because I knew that's where I'd most likely get more pickups from. But just 5 minutes after starting to drive back, I got another order. It was from almost the exact same place I was just at, but maybe a mile further down the road. Despite this seeming really suspicious, it actually wasn't at all to me. This happened every once in a while, where the location was just off or there was a mistake, and so after I decline it, the customer would reorder it right away. And usually the location would fix itself and everything would go smoothly the second time around. I didn't know why the customer didn't just reply to my messages, but whatever. I accepted it, actually glad this whole drive wasn't going to be a waste of time now, and turned around to go back. I passed the previous spot and went a mile further. Again, the whole road was empty and had nothing but sparse forested land on either side. However, this time, when I got to the new location, there was a man standing there on the side of the road. He wore regular jeans and a gray hoodie, and had a backpack or duffel bag slung on his shoulders. As I parked in front of him, I looked behind him and saw nothing that he could have come from. No houses or anything. I wasn't sure how he could have gotten here, or what he was doing out here. He opened the door and got in. The drop-off spot he had marked on the map was only 5 minutes down the road. I hoped it was at somewhere that made more sense, but from the look of things, it was in just as barren a place as I picked him up from. As I drove, the man stayed quiet in the back seat, but he was looking at me a lot. Every time I'd glance in the mirror, his eyes were already on me. I felt an unsettling tension, and with how odd the situation already was beforehand, I started to overthink everything. Like, why were we out here, where he came from, and what he had in the duffel bag. All things I normally wouldn't care about, or even bother to think about. A few minutes later, I got to the drop-off spot that was marked on the map. It was nearly identical to the place I picked him up at. Nothing was around there at all. The silence after pulling up, both of outside and my passenger, had just started to give me a really horrible sense. And before I could say anything, the man told me to get out of the car. I looked back at him in fear to confirm what he just said, finding he already had a gun pointed right at me, and an uncanny, dead look in his eyes as he pointed at the door and repeated himself. I had no choice. I got out, and he followed, going up behind me and telling me to walk. He stayed several feet back, far enough to keep me from trying anything, and he led me off the road and into the forest. I tried to say whatever I could. I mean, I was truly terrified and fearing for my life. The man stayed quiet though, not responding or showing any bit of remorse for what he was doing. We walked deeper and deeper in. It started to get more dense with trees and a lot darker. Time didn't feel like it moved at a regular pace during this whole thing, but I think we walked for 10 full minutes, just going straight into the depths of this forest. But he suddenly said to stop. I stopped in place and could feel my time coming to a close. I was moments away from never being seen again, and my adrenaline flooded my body and just decided to take a chance and bolt deeper into the trees. He yelled stop again, but I just kept running. I used the darkness to my advantage, knowing that because he dragged me so deep into the woods, once I was farther away, he'd have trouble seeing me. I knew he was chasing though, because his voice followed behind me, not fading out. And then, suddenly, there was a gunshot. It rang through the whole forest, and the silence following it was deafening. That was it. He wasn't chasing me anymore. I think he must have fired it out of rage, or just to scare me, knowing I'd already escaped. From that point forward, I just walked in whatever direction. My phone, of course, was still in the car, so I was on my own. After a while, I found a small road with a few houses on it, and was able to get some guy to answer and help me. My car and everything in it was gone by the time officers were searching the area. Although, I don't think this was just a simple robbery. In fact, I'm not even sure that's what he initially planned to do. Unfortunately, though, they never found any traces to lead them to him. Even the account he used on the app ended up being a dead end. I worked as a driver for another few months, but during that time, I got a couple more pickup requests near that spot that all this went down at. And every time I called the police, only for them to show up and find nobody there. Eventually I realized I was so schizo and paranoid about it that I just found a different gig. Spending the weekend alone at my cabin-style house on the edge of town. It wasn't isolated in the middle of nowhere. There were other houses around, but they were spaced out enough that you could go days without seeing anyone around. I never got visitors, like solicitors or neighbors. The houses in this neighborhood were the kind people drove past without even thinking about it, because unless you looked intently, you probably just saw an endless forest of trees. It was winter, right after a heavy snowfall, so everything felt quieter than usual. A thick blanket of snow covered the whole area, and the woods behind my house looked deeper and darker than they usually did. I didn't mind being alone out there for the most part. The house was cozy, with lots of big windows, a stone fireplace, and just overall that nice cabin feeling. It was the whole reason I moved there. The first night, nothing weird happened until late. I stayed up watching YouTube videos in the living room, kind of half asleep by midnight. After a while, I turned off the TV and headed to my room. It was a one-story home, so my bedroom sat right at the end of the hallway. The thing about the bedroom is that it matched the rest of the home, having these massive floor-to-ceiling windows along the wall, and even a sliding glass door that opened toward the woods. Because the home was in a private location, with just the woods on all sides and no close neighbors, it made sense, I guess. But it did feel strange sometimes. Even just seeing my reflection in the glass at night would startle me, thinking someone was standing out there. But this night was different. As I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I heard something. This soft cracking sound coming from outside. Not like an animal or the typical forest noise. This was louder, like someone stepping on a thick branch. A couple seconds later, it happened again. I sat up and looked toward the large window. Because the lights were off in my room, I could see outside through the glass pretty well. I stared for maybe 30 seconds before something moved in the solid darkness between the tall pine trees. Not a shape I could describe, just a quick shift of a shadow between two trees. Like someone leaned out of view, or leaned into view. I couldn't tell. Everything was still after minutes of waiting and staring out there, feeling nerves building up in me. I started to think I might have just imagined it. Like my eyes were just seeing shapes in the dark. But I didn't move for a long time. Eventually though, I got up, double-checked the sliding door was locked, then got back in bed. After that, it took me forever to fall asleep. Every 30 seconds, I felt like I had to open my eyes and look out the window again. But every time, I saw nothing. The next day was strange. Nothing outright happened, but everything felt off in a way I couldn't explain. I'd constantly get that subtle, uneasy feeling, like someone was standing just out of sight, staring in. I kept glancing at whatever window was behind me, half expecting to see eyes looking in. I never did, but the feeling didn't go away. As it got later and became dark again, snow began coming down again, which eased my senses a bit. I think it made it even more unlikely anyone would be outside lurking around when it was cold and snowy, so I tried not to overthink. Around 10, I was watching TV in the living room, wrapped up in a blanket by the fireplace. The glow of the TV screen lit up most of the house, so I didn't even realize how dark it was inside until I left the couch to get a soda. And as I walked through the main hallway, I noticed the light in the far room, the small den with bookshelves, was off. I could have sworn I left it on earlier. I usually always kept it on because it provided a nice ambient light, so the house didn't feel like a shadowy cave. I went over and quickly flipped the light back on, figuring nothing of it, and getting my soda and sitting back down. I was maybe back on the couch for a minute, having just unpaused the TV, when I happened to glance over my shoulder. I wasn't even trying to check anything. It was just one of those automatic glances you do for no reason. but the light in the room was off again. I could feel the blood rush from my face. I stood up and walked down the hallway, just enough to see the switch from where I was standing. The switch was in the off position, physically flipped down. I just stared at it. Someone was in that room, and it was like they were trying to lure me in there. I started to back away. My phone was charging on the nightstand in my room, and my car keys were by the front door. I knew I needed to get both and leave immediately. I quietly moved to the other hallway and into my bedroom, grabbing my phone, but not before seeing something shift behind the glass. I looked up, and at first, all I saw were faint footprints going through the snow behind the window, until it led my eyes to a large figure, a man, standing just a couple feet behind the window. He was entirely covered by the dark, but I knew he was looking in at me. I sprinted back down the hall toward the front door, getting my keys, and hearing not one, but two sets of footsteps on the other side of the house. I opened the door and ran to the side driveway, where my car was. As soon as I got in, I saw that same figure come barreling around the house and running toward my car. I turned it on and fled for the main road, seeing his figure standing where my car just came from and watching me drive away. It took a little over 30 minutes for officers to arrive on my property. What they found was horrifying. Multiple windows were shattered, and the whole house looked like it had been destroyed on the inside. Doors and cabinets ripped from their hinges, furniture flipped over, and dents and tears in the walls. I told the police that I'd heard two people inside and saw one man outside, but the condition they left the house in, it was impossible to know how the two got in quietly while I was at home all day. I stayed in a hotel for weeks after that, getting the house repaired and putting it up for sale. I couldn't get over the feeling of knowing 3 people had been stalking me for who knows how long. And had I not escaped, I can't even imagine the horrible, disturbing things that would have happened that night. Even now, I have nightmares of me in that hallway, walking toward the room with the light off, knowing what was waiting for me just outside of view of the doorway.
Turn great savings into great nights. The President's Day mattress sale is on now at Raymore and Flanagan. You can also combine select mattress sale pricing with special financing only in stores. Don't miss the President's Day mattress sale at Raymore and Flanagan.
However you book your hotel, first check Kayak to see what lots of people say about where you're planning to stay. Then do what people do. Recheck sites Kayak already checked. Beach bike rentals. Sounds cool, if only you learned how to ride a bike.
My name is Noah, and I'm 36. I'm gonna have to run you through a bit of backstory just to give context for why I live where I do. 2 years before this happened, me and my wife broke up just a few months after buying a house together. It wasn't a bad breakup, and we technically didn't divorce until months later, but I digress. The house we bought was massive, like way too big for even the both of us. But it was supposed to be something we could grow into and maybe have kids and dogs and whatever in the future. After we split ways, it was left for me to figure out whether to sell it for a loss or just continue living in it. I chose to stay. So I lived alone in that house for 2 whole years. I told myself I'd find a way to use the space. Like, since I worked from home, maybe I'd use a room for my office, and then have a workout room and a bedroom, all separate, so that it wasn't all that empty. But I never really got around to it. The entire huge house was mostly left hollow and vacant. If you opened a random door, there's a good chance nothing would be behind it but a dusty, unused room. I wouldn't even go into half the rooms for months at a time. I didn't mind it too much, but occasionally I'd get that uneasy feeling of being alone in a giant, empty house. That, mixed with just overall loneliness, I finally decided to do something I'd been wanting to do for years, and adopt a dog from a shelter. That's when all of this started. I found a small 8-month-old puppy named Piper. She was a beagle, and I picked her up after work from a shelter about 3 hours away from me. So by the time I'd gotten home, it was around 8 p.m. I let her roam around the yard for a bit, then showed her inside to let her explore her new home. In the shelter, Piper was very excited and happy and energetic, and even on the car ride home. But as soon as I let her inside, she became very timid. I thought she was just unfamiliar with the home, and all the change was making her anxious, so I didn't think too much into it. I left her alone to explore and sat on the couch to give her space. She spent all but 2 minutes walking around before jumping up on the couch with me, huddling up right on my lap. She almost seemed afraid of something. But again, I had every reason to believe it was all just normal behavior of a new pup moving into a new home. Later, I brought her upstairs and we went to bed. In the morning, everything seemed a little better. She followed me around while I made breakfast and coffee, then sat below my office desk while I worked for the day. However, a few hours in, she got up and walked toward the doorway, standing halfway in the hall, looking very alert. Then, after a few seconds, she fully left the room, and I could hear her nails clicking on the floor, walking down the hallway toward the staircase. I thought she finally felt comfortable enough to look around, so I left her alone and kept working. I want to say 10 minutes went by, when suddenly she started barking like crazy from somewhere downstairs. I jumped up from the desk and quickly hurried through the hallway and down the steps, still with her barks echoing all throughout the home, down every corridor, making it hard to even tell where she was. I called out her name and moved through all the rooms before finding her. Strangely, Piper was standing right in the middle of one of the empty rooms downstairs. Like she was just standing, looking at the wall and barking. Once she saw me, she hurried over and stood right next to me, tail down and looking nervously at the empty room. I walked in, and there was nothing to look at or make sense of. It was entirely empty. I tried to calm her down, picking her up and closing the door to the room. I brought her back upstairs to the office, and after a few minutes, I continued working. The rest of that day, not much happened. When I finished work, I took her for a walk around the area. Then we spent the night watching TV, going upstairs and getting in bed at 10. But in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not to a noise or anything. I guess just a feeling. I sat up and saw Piper standing right up to the bedroom door, her ears up and her gaze locked on the gap in the doorway. I called her name, but she didn't move. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure how or why, but I laid back down and fell asleep without a second thought. Can't even believe I managed to, now that I'm thinking back on it. I guess I really just thought she was uncomfortable being in a new place. But I woke up in the morning and things seemed to be okay. Piper was up on the bed with me and didn't act strange at all. I got dressed and headed downstairs, letting her outside and doing my typical morning routine. When she came back in, we both headed upstairs to my desk. Just like the day before, she laid down right under my desk while I worked. I made sure to check on her a few times, looking under the desk at her, and every time she was just sleeping, so I kept working. I think it wasn't until almost 6 o'clock, when I was just about done with work and the sun had mostly gone down, that I looked under my desk again, and she wasn't there. I looked around the room, and she was just gone. Must have slipped out without me noticing. I closed my laptop and got up, calling Piper's name as I walked into the hallway. But I didn't hear anything. Didn't hear her walking around or barking or anything at all. The house was dead silent. Piper? Piper, where you at? My voice echoed through the house. I felt something unnerving come over me as I started walking down the hall and down to the first floor. There were no signs of her. It was so quiet I could hear my own heart beating. I walked down the next hallway, leading to the room I found her in yesterday. As I got closer, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open, which I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I pushed it further open. Piper was sitting in the far corner of the room, shivering and facing the doorway I was in. She looked terrified, like something else was in the house with us. It gave me a sense to turn around before approaching her, and when I checked behind me, I barely caught a glimpse of someone peering down the hallway, back by the stairs. I quickly backed into the room and slammed the door, locking it and moving toward Piper. A few seconds later, quiet footsteps started coming down the hallway. He came right up to the other side of the door. Piper began quietly whimpering, still huddled in the corner, staring at the door. I was honestly too scared to even move. I just stood there, in the middle of the room, waiting for something to happen. The person behind the door didn't move either for a while, before they started quietly walking back down the hallway. It was almost terrifying how confident it felt they were, not running or anything. Felt like they weren't fazed by anything going on, or that this was exactly what they wanted, which made me wonder what it was exactly they were here for. I didn't hear anything after that. I think I stayed in that room with Piper for 30 minutes. I just couldn't get myself to move. When I eventually opened the door, I looked down the unlit hallway, and all the way at the end, I could see the front door was wide open. Hoping it meant whoever that was gone, I ran back upstairs to get my phone and call the cops. While I was up there, I noticed several open doors that, again, I had always kept closed. As soon as I got my phone, I ran back down to Piper and held up inside that room until police made it. They searched, not only inside, but also several acres around the house, but found nothing. No signs of the intruder still being around. However, they did find signs of him having been in my home. In one of the rooms upstairs, the one right next to my office, there were a bunch of random items suggesting that someone had been living there, maybe for months. And worse yet, it seemed like the person had likely been spending the days sleeping in the closet, so I wouldn't notice or hear them, and would then come out at night to leave and re-enter the home or to hang around inside the house. Of course, bringing Piper into my home, she could probably sense someone else was inside with us. Makes me think of when I woke up in the middle of the night, finding Piper staring at the door. He could have been walking around right outside the bedroom. And as for the room she was barking at the wall or ceiling in, it was the room directly below the one the person was using as their hideout. She might have heard them move around up there or something. After it was all said and done, this event was enough to get me to finally sell the house and move into something smaller, bringing Piper with, of course. She's absolutely the best companion I ever could have asked for, and since moving, she's been just as happy and excited as she was when I found her at the shelter, and hasn't been anxious in the slightest. I still worry about the person not being found though, and would come back. I know it's unlikely, but I think I'll never really forget about it. Last November, I took a road trip out to my family's home for Thanksgiving. I lived around 20 hours away, which in road trip time is about 3 days of driving comfortably, and 2 days if really pushing it. This drive I'd done before, and hated it every time because of how incredibly boring most of it was. My parents lived on a small ranch that to me felt like the middle of nowhere, so a big portion of the drive was through nothing, either just plain open fields or vast untouched forests. After hours and hours of the same scenery, it always got painfully boring. The first half of the drive from leaving my city was always alright though. It was on the typical highways that mostly everyone takes if they were headed to or from a major city. However, it was toward the end of my second day of driving that I merged off of that highway and onto, I guess you'd call, a side road. It was still a highway, but only one lane, and way less people drove on it, not truckers or anything. And it really only led out to smaller, less distinguished towns. I made it to this part around 7 or 8 in the afternoon, so I wasn't planning to drive too much longer. I hoped there would be a town I could pull off in that had a motel or something. I drove another 2-ish hours. The road was completely dark and empty, just my headlights lighting up the way through the fog. I hadn't seen a single place to pull off and sleep at, so eventually when I found a small gas station, I figured it was better than nothing and pulled in. Now this gas station looked extremely old. It looked like it was just some sort of family-owned place in the middle of nothing. I didn't see a single light in the distance of any sort of town or even houses. However, the gas station's lights were on, and I was able to use the pump to top off my tank. Afterward, I parked in a spot on the side of the building and headed inside to ask if I could sleep for a few hours in their parking lot. When I walked in, a single guy was standing behind the counter, looked maybe 50, and was taken aback by me walking in. Guess customers don't usually stop by this late. I asked him if I could park for a couple hours. He mentioned right away that the station was closing in 15 minutes, and he would be leaving, but that if I was comfortable staying at the empty place overnight, then he didn't mind. I thanked him and bought a couple energy drinks for tomorrow, then headed back out to my car. But I replayed the conversation in my head, and I thought it was kind of weird the way he said, if I was comfortable. It sounded like he was saying I really shouldn't be, or that most people around here wouldn't be comfortable with it. I figured maybe he meant that most people just didn't sleep in their cars, and not that sleeping in my car here specifically is the problem. I got back in my car and laid the seat back, setting an alarm for 3 a.m., which was about 4 hours from then. After 15 minutes, I heard the guy lock up the gas station doors, and his car drive away. I looked around. Now, without the gas station lights on, it was pitch black, and extremely quiet. It was actually kind of eerie, being alone there. I closed my eyes again. Honestly, I'm unsure whether I fell asleep or not, because my eyes were closed and I was trying to for so long, at least an hour or so, when I suddenly heard the sound of tires pulling into the gravel outside of the gas station. They got closer and closer until I eventually opened my eyes to see what was going on. I felt my heart get a little faster, seeing a dark pickup truck right beside my car. What the hell were they doing here? None of their headlights were on either. I couldn't see the driver, or really anything other than the truck outlined by the darkness around it. But it was facing me, so I felt like there was a chance whoever was in there could see me. I got really uncomfortable and didn't want to take any chances. I quickly put my seat back up, turned my car on, and drove out of there. I hoped it was nothing, but the way it all happened felt really strange. An empty, closed gas station in the middle of nowhere, and the truck decides to pull in with all its lights off and pull right up to my car. Couldn't really think of how that wasn't something bad. Getting out of there and back on the road made me feel a lot safer though. However, I barely got a quarter mile away from the gas station before I hit something in the middle of the gravel road. I only caught a glimpse of it in my headlights before my tire ran it over, and it sounded like a pretty bad hit. I quickly pulled off to the side and looked in my rear mirror, but couldn't get a good enough look. So I put the car in park and stepped out. Again, I noticed how quiet it was outside. Just the cold wind blowing around as I walked down the road and tried to see what it was that I hit. It looked like a large duffel bag, but like really large. And honestly, the reason I was so curious as to get out and look is because it kind of looked like a body bag. Maybe it was just my mind's tendency to always think the worst. But I didn't even get close enough to it before hearing the distant sound of tires pushing through the gravel down the road. I looked up and saw nothing but pitch black as the sound got closer and closer. I ran back to my car and got in. I glanced in my mirror as the sound got even louder before that truck suddenly appeared in my back headlights. It looked like they were going insanely fast, speeding right past the object in the road and suddenly slamming on their brakes and swerving behind my car, abruptly stopping. The front and side door both opened and two men jumped out, but by then I was already flooring it back down the road. I couldn't believe how much my hands were shaking as I tried to call 911. Each time, the call would connect for a couple of seconds, then the line would drop because I had no signal. Thankfully, I don't think the truck continued to follow me though, as I never saw them again. That stretch of road went on for maybe 45 minutes before I found a different road to get on that led to a more populated area. Calling the police at that point probably didn't help much, but I did anyway. Half hour later, I got a call back saying they found nothing at all in the area. The rest of the drive, and honestly the entire trip, I was genuinely horrified of what I might have stumbled across that night. I don't know what that truck was up to, or what I saw in the middle of the road, but thinking about what it all could have been still gives me chills. I never took that way ever again, and haven't heard of any information as to what might have happened that night.
This President's Day, upgrade the look of your home without breaking your budget. Save up to 50% site-wide on new window treatments at Blinds.com. Blinds.com.
It was snowing on this Halloween. Me and my friend group were all planning to have a big night of trick-or-treating, but with the snow coming down pretty heavily, a lot of their parents wouldn't let them out for too long. To be fair, it usually wasn't this bad in October around here, but for the last week, our city was in the middle of an early snowstorm. Anyway, it ended up being just me and my friends John and Hayden. They were still able and willing to go trick-or-treating. We all put on some heavy snow gear, boots, jackets, hats, all that stuff. Pretty much the only parts of our costumes you could see were the masks we were wearing. We started trick-or-treating. For the first couple hours, there were a decent amount of kids running around doing the same as us. But once the sun got lower, it was basically just us three, walking around in the snow. We continued going door to door, eventually getting up to one of the houses on the corner of the block. There was nothing unusual about it. We went up, knocked on the door, and got candy from the older woman that lived there. But it was when we turned to leave the porch that we walked past a man on the driveway. He had a thick jacket on, and a really creepy mask. More creepy than the typical ones you see, as this one looked kind of realistic. even having long black hair attached to it, draping over his shoulders. Hayden said he recognized the mask as Momo, which, if you were around on the internet about a decade ago, you've probably heard of it. It's unsettling to say the least, but definitely not something most younger kids would be comfortable with seeing, even on Halloween. We all noticed him and felt really weird about it. The man wasn't walking up or down the driveway. He was just standing there in the snow, watching us. We continued down the sidewalk, turning back a few times to look at him, but the blizzard quickly covered up our view of him. I think another thing that made us feel a little uneasy about it was that it was clearly a man, not a kid. He was tall and completely alone out there. So what was he doing? John convinced us to skip a few houses, just to be safe. I don't think any of us wanted to run into that guy again. We crossed over to the next street and got back to going door to door. Have to say, the whiteout from the snow keeping us from seeing anything more than a house or two down the road made things a lot more uncomfortable. We had no idea if the man was still out there. I think 30 minutes passed. The sun was fully down, and even the streetlights were barely beaming through the falling snow. It was around then that John said he had to go back home, since his parents told him to be back by sundown, if it was still snowing. Hayden and I walked with him back to his house, then decided on what to do with just the two of us. I know it hadn't really been that long, but by this point, neither of us were thinking about that creepy man anymore. He hadn't actually done anything, and we never saw him following us, so we had no reason to keep thinking about it. Me and Hayden went to a few more doors and got some more candy, before we both were getting really cold and found ourselves just not enjoying it too much. So Hayden split ways and went back home, leaving me to head back to my house alone. It was about a 15-minute walk away, but in the snow, probably longer. Almost immediately, once it was just me out there, it hardly felt like Halloween. Snow covering every inch of the neighborhood, and nobody else walking around. Literally just me. Once I realized that, I started getting a little paranoid, looking all around and hoping to see another group of trick-or-treaters. But instead, I saw something else. On the other side of the street from the sidewalk I was on, there was a forest, and through the trees, someone was watching me. At first, I just saw his figure, standing far back, and mostly covered by the darkness and the falling snow. But as I continued walking and looking across the street, the figure moved with me, matching my pace and staying in view of me. I started to walk faster, eventually getting to a turn where I could go deeper into the neighborhood, where there were more houses and no forests. But the figure followed. He walked out of the tree line, and when he passed under a streetlight, I saw that same disturbing mask with the long black hair. He must have followed us the entire time, waiting for one of us to be alone. I hurried, moving as fast as I could. The empty and quiet streets made it feel like I was running for my life in an abandoned neighborhood. When I made it home, I locked the door behind me, but for some reason didn't tell my parents what was happening. I just went straight to my room. I guess I was scared to admit that I thought someone was actually following me, as if not admitting it would somehow make it not true. For a few minutes, I just sat on my bed and caught my breath, until the doorbell rang. I immediately felt a chill run through me, knowing that I saw no one else outside while I was running back home. I heard my parents talking, confused that any kids were still out trick-or-treating. My mom went and grabbed some of the candy that they'd already put away. Then she answered the door. As she did, I quietly walked around to the hallway and looked down at who was at the door. My stomach dropped. It was the tall man in the mask, and although I couldn't see his eyes, I know he saw me at the back of the hallway. He didn't even take any candy or say anything to my mom. He just walked away. Likely, the man was hoping I would be alone. My mom found it really creepy and strange, knowing as well that it was an adult, but she assumed it was just a dumb Halloween prank. I never told her what really happened, or what that man was really trying to do that night. Where I live, around Halloween, it always gets pretty cold. Sometimes it snows, sometimes it doesn't. But regardless, that's just how it's always been. This year, on Halloween, it had snowed pretty heavily overnight, and by the time trick-or-treat hours had started, it began snowing again. There weren't too many crowds out because of it. I was just chilling inside at home, handing out candy whenever someone did come by, and watching TV by the fireplace to pass the time. All the kids that came by had heavy jackets or coats covering their whole costumes, so the whole Halloween spirit wasn't really hitting too hard this year. As the night went on, the snow started coming down even harder, which sent pretty much all the kids home that were already stubborn enough to still go out in the cold before. 30 minutes went by, with no kids coming to the door. It was around 7 o'clock, and the sun had already set, so I assumed that the trick-or-treating was done for the night. I got up from the living room and started walking over to the door, but immediately was taken aback. The front door was open, swaying in the cold wind that was blowing into the house. I walked over and looked out, not seeing anyone, then closed it. I stood there and thought about it for a second, figuring I probably just didn't fully close it earlier, whenever the last kids came by, and the wind must have pushed it further open. I mean, I knew I didn't lock it, because it was Halloween, and I was constantly opening it anyway. I let it off as nothing to worry about, and went back to the couch. I did open up the curtains by the window, on my way back, just to watch the snow fall. Another few hours went by, as the night got colder and the snow came down even harsher. I had to check the weather a few times to make sure there wasn't some kind of massive blizzard hitting our town. I think it was around 10 that I started to feel tired enough to go to bed, so I turned everything off and went to the kitchen to finish doing some dishes from dinner that I hadn't cleaned up yet. It was just something I did as part of my nightly routine, cleaning up the place before going to sleep. As I was down there putting things away though, I heard what sounded like a creaking noise above me. I literally stopped what I was doing and stared at the blank ceiling, listening to the sound until it quietly faded out. I was kind of in awe for a moment. It sounded just like a door opening, which ironically in the moment I thought sounded way too much like a horror movie to actually be what it was. I finished up downstairs, turned all the lights off, then headed upstairs to go to bed and check on whatever that sound was that I heard. Honestly, I didn't expect to find anything at all, and didn't really care that much. But when I got to my bedroom, I immediately noticed the closet was open. This changed everything for me, instantly making me unsettled. I put everything together, between the front door being randomly found open, and then this door also suddenly opening. This couldn't be a coincidence. For good measure, I looked into the closet and didn't see anything. I kinda was hoping there would be something obvious to tell me that something was definitely off. I even checked around the room. I just couldn't see how if someone had snuck inside, why weren't there any other signs of them? Like, where the hell were they? And what was the point of sneaking in, if just to open a few doors? I was still feeling really uneasy, so I shut the bedroom door and locked it while I paced the room and thought about everything. And at some point, when I happened to be facing the door, I saw something. A shadow right under the door. It only took a few seconds to be almost sure that someone was standing right behind it. I tried not to move or make any sounds, even though, looking back, whoever was behind that door obviously knew I was already in there. I guess I just didn't want them to know that I knew. I must have stood there frozen, staring at the shadow under the door for an entire 2 or 3 minutes. I wanted to call the police, but didn't want them to hear me, which left me just unsure what to do. I think it was actually because I didn't move or make any noise for so long, though, that whoever was behind there must have realized something was wrong and that I was probably onto them, because the doorknob slowly turned a few times, clicking against the lock. Then the shadow moved away from the door. Maybe they recognized I could see the shadow under the door. I don't know. But after that, I waited for probably 10 minutes straight. I didn't hear anything else or see anything. I had no idea if the person was even still behind the door, let alone in my house. Eventually, I had to call the police, but still tried to be quiet. It seemed like the intruder had left, though, because cops walked in and didn't find anyone else in the house. The whole thing is really just a terrifying mess. I can't even imagine what would have happened if I didn't close and lock the door when I did. Even a few minutes later would have changed everything about that night. Obviously, because I never saw the intruder, I had no info to give the police aside from some possible suspects, like crazy exes or whatever, which I didn't really have. There's no saying who it was or what they were going to do.
When that personalization happens, you are getting better care.
I'm 32 and live in a small home on the countryside. This night was pretty much going normally, up until just before bed. I had this day off and was home all day. I didn't notice anything unusual. Around 9 p.m., I went up to my bedroom and got ready for bed. I was on my phone watching YouTube while trying to fall asleep, when I started to hear something. I paused the video. Faintly, I could hear someone talking outside. At least 2 people, maybe more though. The way they were talking was like they were trying to be quiet, which made it all the more suspicious. And this was actually the first time I've ever had anyone trespass, at least that I know of. I mean, I lived pretty far from other houses, and there were no sidewalks or anything near my house, so anyone walking around this close had to know what they were doing. I sat up in bed and tried to listen to what the guys were saying, but it was still too faint, so I got up and went over to the window. As soon as I stepped up to it, all the voices suddenly stopped talking. A chill ran through my body, knowing this had to mean that whoever was out there could see me. But all I saw was darkness covering the entirety of my property. The thought of all their eyes staring up at me in the window was really unsettling. I quickly backed away. I really hoped this was all just an accident, like they somehow didn't know they happened to walk onto my property. But if that was the case, why didn't they leave when they saw my house? Why did it sound like the voices were walking up closer to the house? I waited a few minutes, then walked up to the window again. But again, I didn't see anything. I then went downstairs and up to basically every window, trying to see anything at all. It was the fear of not knowing what was going on, or where they were, that made it so unsettling. I think it was probably 30 minutes after initially hearing the men outside that I decided to risk opening the front door to get a better look and listen. I turned on the light, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. After a few seconds, I stepped a bit further from the door. I didn't hear anything but the wind and the soft sound of crickets in the distance. And past the light, it was way too dark to make out any shapes of trees or anything. But as I stood out there, an overwhelming feeling came over me. My eyes started shifting all around, and I became very paranoid. It was like I could sense multiple eyes looking at me from somewhere. I quickly hurried back inside and locked the door. Probably just a gut feeling, but it felt like something was about to happen. I don't know what, but I didn't want to find out. Once I was inside and with all the doors locked, the feeling faded away, which made me think it really was just a feeling. I grabbed a glass of water and went back upstairs, letting myself calm down and relax before getting back in bed and trying to fall asleep. Took a while, but I did manage to. Had to have been asleep for a few hours, but I was woken up violently by a crashing sound from the hallway just outside my bedroom. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, sprinting up to the door and opening it. I looked into the hallway. There was shattered glass spread all over the floor. Someone had thrown a rock straight through the window that was on the back hallway wall. I genuinely couldn't believe it and stood in shock for several seconds as I processed what this meant. Then I heard the voices again, multiple, all yelling commands at each other, and in between their shouting were heavy slams against the front door. The weight of it shook the whole house. Among the heavy slams, more windows were getting shattered as I went back into the bedroom and locked myself in. I dialed 911. It was while I was still on the call that I heard the terrifying sound of the door crashing open and multiple people running into the house. Their footsteps ran through the bottom floor. I could even hear some of them laughing. The operator on the line said an officer was 5 minutes away, but knowing the group had already broken inside and could probably easily take down the bedroom door, I didn't feel safe waiting. I went up to the window and opened it. Because this place was a ranch home with sloped ceilings, this window gave access to the roof. Obviously, you weren't supposed to get onto the roof from there, as it was incredibly dangerous, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. I crawled out and onto the roof, then closed the window and moved further up to the top. A minute later, the men started banging on the bedroom door. A couple of them yelled to open up, some even using a jokingly friendly voice. It was sickening. Then, it only took a few hits before they bashed it open. Their footsteps scattered around below me. After looking for 30 seconds, I could hear them getting frustrated. They moved through the entire upper floor, probably double-checking every room. After that, I really don't know what was going on. They remained inside the house, though, until police sirens were coming up in the distance. Then the group ran back out of the house and straight into the darkness. I stayed on the roof until officers were inside and able to help me down. I still can't believe I got away from that. A whole group aggressively breaking into my home on the countryside in the middle of the night while I was alone. I can only imagine what they were trying to do. My home was basically trashed, but nothing was really missing, which unfortunately means they definitely were looking for me. I don't know if it was me specifically, or they just happened to choose my house just because, but I don't think I'll ever know. used to work the night shift at a small shipping warehouse right outside of town. It wasn't a big place, just a long concrete building with 3 loading docks, a tiny office, and endless rows of metal shelving. Most nights, it was only me and 1 or 2 other guys, but the company cut hours during the slow season, so for a few weeks, I was completely alone from midnight to 6 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. I guess the peace and quiet was nice, and the job was easy enough. I kept my earbuds in most of the night and tried to not think about how quiet it was. Heavy machines that ran all day were silent at night, so even the smallest noise echoed. This night in particular was very quiet. No cars driving on the highway outside or even wind hitting the building. From inside, I could hear the soft sound of crickets in the forest that was just beside the building because there was nothing to drown out the noise. At some point early in my shift, I put my earbuds in and worked for a good while without stopping. I was in the far back corner, scanning a pallet, when I heard something that made me stop. Footsteps. Light ones. Not hurried or heavy, but almost definitely footsteps. They came from the front of the warehouse, near the office. At first, I thought my boss might have stopped by without texting me, which has happened before, and gave me as good of a scare as you'd imagine. I took my earbuds out and listened again, but now there was nothing. After a minute, I told myself I imagined it, but then just as I started getting back to work, I heard them again. Just a few footsteps, slow and spaced out, like whoever it was wasn't sure where they were going. "John? That you?" I called out my boss's name, but he didn't call back, and the footsteps seemed to stop too. I walked toward the front, trying to act like I wasn't nervous. The warehouse lights didn't reach the office area that well, leaving that part of the building dim and shadowy. I flipped on the office light and checked inside. I even checked the break room, and found nothing. Didn't know what else to do, other than shake it off and get back to work. Usually, I didn't get worked up about stuff like this, so I knew either tonight I was just feeling off, or something was actually off about the warehouse. Another hour went by, and I'd finished scanning what I needed to, and headed back to the office to log everything and check on a couple of things. Like I said before, the office was kind of in the back corner of the building. I sat down and started doing all the boring computer work of just clicking through things and adjusting the numbers from the scans. I was in there no more than 5 minutes, when for some reason I looked up at the hallway window, the one that overlooked the warehouse floor. Someone was walking between the shelving rows. Just a silhouette, barely visible, but I felt like even from the quick half look I saw, the movement was clearly someone walking. I stood up so fast the chair tipped over, and I shouted "hey" at them to try to get them to stop. My voice resonated down the warehouse, but after they disappeared out of view behind the shelf, I didn't see anything. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find to defend myself, some old metal tool from the desk, and stepped outside the office. I started slowly walking down, and I kept calling out something along the lines of "who's here" and "you can't be in here" over and over. No matter how hard I tried to fake it, my voice didn't sound confident at all. I moved aisle by aisle, checking corners and even looking behind boxes where a grown adult couldn't possibly be hiding, and yet I still found no one. Eventually, I made it to the far back wall, and every row behind me was empty. I sort of stared at the warehouse with this blank stare, trying to understand this. The only other place I could look were the couple side hallways that I guess if it really was a person I saw, they could have snuck into, but I felt like I would have heard the heavy metal doors opening and closing. But there was no way I'd be able to get back to work without checking. I opened one of the doors and looked down. This area I hadn't really been to. I think it led to all the manager's offices and stuff like that I had no business ever being in. I didn't see anyone though, so I turned around and let the door start closing behind me. And just when I did, I heard the sound of a door opening from down the corridor. I quickly spun around and grabbed the door before it shut, looking down the hall again. There was a man now, standing right at the end of the corridor. He looked early 20s, but not like the normal young guy you usually see. He looked disheveled and crazy, eyes wide open enough for me to see them from all the way down at the other end of the hall. I don't know if he was on something or what, but it was horrifying and disturbing the way he looked at me. I called out, asking what he was here for, and telling him he needed to go. The guy didn't even look like he comprehended what I said. I called out again, trying to sound more aggressive, and mentioning that I'd called security, which was a lie, but I hoped it would work. He started taking a few steps forward. I couldn't tell if he was complying with me or just trying to close the distance, so I just stood in the doorway trying to talk to him still. Think it was when he was about 15 to 20 feet away that I noticed something in his hand, and by the time I looked back up at his eyes, he lifted his arm and hurled it at me, chucked it with all of his strength, sending it flying right at my head, only missing me by a couple of inches and hitting the door frame beside me. It was a hammer or a large metal wrench. The harsh metal echo it made when it hit the door frame felt like it burst my eardrums. I immediately turned and booked it out of there, hearing the guy chase me like his life depended on it. I looked over my shoulder a couple times, seeing him still just 10 to 15 feet behind me, with that horrifying look in his eyes. I made it to the office and locked myself in, hearing him slam his body into the metal door and try opening it. Luckily, this office was solid, only having that metal door and the window, which was the super sturdy kind, like maybe 4 inches thick of heavy-duty glass that isn't supposed to shatter in a rough work environment. The guy moved around to the window and started ravagely slamming his shoulder into it and punching it. He looked absolutely insane, but he eventually realized he couldn't break in and turned around and just walked away, slowly making his way down to the other end of the building and I'm assuming out the back door. I was already using the office phone to contact the police by this point, but it took forever for them to get to the warehouse, so the guy really could have been anywhere by this point. This wasn't some fancy new warehouse either, so the cameras were awful. It showed us the guy breaking into one of the doors and walking around, almost stalking me during my whole shift, but there were no clear views of his face to identify him with. Wasn't any way to know why he broke in or was trying to attack me either. I stayed at that job for a while afterward, and the event almost started to not even feel real because of how crazy it was. Eventually though, I did leave and get a similar gig somewhere else, figuring it wasn't worth hanging around with the chance the guy could come back looking for me. I was 18, still living with my parents, but because I was old enough, they could leave me home alone without it being a problem. This was one of the times where my parents were gone for I think a couple of days. Our home wasn't anything special, really just a typical neighborhood home in the suburbs. And as far as these sort of days go, I usually just sat around the house and watched TV or played video games. I didn't have my own car, so unless I felt like walking 30 minutes for some fast food, I had no reason to leave the house. In the morning, I pretty much just stayed in bed for a few hours watching TV. Then finally got up to start my day, heading downstairs to the kitchen. Almost as soon as I got downstairs and started making breakfast, my friend sent me a text. I assumed he was just waiting for me to get online, so I finished making breakfast before even checking it. But when I did finally open it, I was a little confused. He said, "Who's the guy outside your house?" I genuinely was caught off guard by that. I responded, "What?" and went to the front window to look, but nobody was out there. No cars, no people, just an empty, quiet neighborhood. My friend's house was directly across from mine, and I didn't see him in the window or anything, so I was confused. After a minute, I decided to just call him, figuring it was some stupid joke he was trying to pull. He was the kind of friend to say stupid stuff like this sometimes, to mess with me. But this time, I really didn't see where the joke in it was. He answered, and didn't even try to play it as a joke. He was serious, saying he actually saw some guy outside my house that he'd never seen before, and the only reason he even mentioned it was because the guy seemed like he was trying to look into the windows. That was super weird, but neither of us could figure out who it was or what he was doing, and with him not there anymore, we kind of just moved on from it and hopped on a Discord call to play video games for a few hours. I only went downstairs once during that time to refill my water, and I did a quick look out the window again, not seeing anyone. We were online until probably 5 or 6 before getting off the call. All I remember was that it was already dark outside, and I realized how much time had passed. I got up and went downstairs. I started making a quick dinner, unsure how I'd spend the rest of my night. Probably just watch TV in my room. But while I was in the kitchen cooking, I saw a shadow move or flicker on the wall in front of me. I immediately turned around. I saw nothing, no movement or anything in the living room that could have moved, until I saw the window. I walked up to it and looked out. It was dark and still. I didn't see anyone. The image of someone possibly staring at me from outside gave me chills though, but I thought I was probably just on edge. I mean, the shadow I saw could have been a car passing by or something. I was sure it was nothing to worry about. I finished making dinner and went upstairs to my room to eat, then laid in bed and watched TV. I was up there for at least an hour, maybe a little more, just zoning out and half watching whatever was on. At some point, as it got later and darker in my room, I realized I hadn't turned on any of the lights upstairs. It was just the TV lighting up my room, and I kept finding my eyes shifting and looking at the crack under the bedroom door, seeing it was completely dark in the hallway outside my room. Usually that would never bother me, but this night it just felt off. Eventually I paused the show and decided to get up and grab a snack from downstairs, though it was more of an excuse to go around and turn all the lights on as well, and hopefully shake whatever feeling I had. As soon as I opened my bedroom door though, the feeling grew worse. It felt like the house was too quiet, and the hallway was eerily dark. I flicked on the light, seeing it was just an empty hallway, and feeling silly or almost annoyed with myself for being creeped out. I headed downstairs. Before getting a snack, I checked out the windows. This paranoia I was feeling wasn't something I think I'd ever felt before, at least not to this degree. I even left all the lights on downstairs, knowing that I wasn't planning on coming back down before bed, just so I didn't have to think about it being pitch black down there. I started going back upstairs, but on my way up the steps, I paused. I thought I'd heard what sort of sounded like my footsteps resonating through the house, but it didn't quite sound right, and I'd never heard the house echo sounds like that before. I took a few steps down and then back up, and it didn't make the same sound. I stood there unsure for a moment, replaying what I'd heard over and over in my head, I felt my eyes get wider and my heart begin racing before I bolted up the stairs and into my room, locking the door shut and calling the police. I was 99% sure that what I'd heard was someone else's footsteps in the house matching mine, almost like they were mimicking me walking so that I wouldn't hear them coming up behind me. When I was standing on the stairs thinking about it, I realized that was exactly what it sounded like. After the police were on the way, I called my friend, asking if he saw anything. He said no, but went to the front window while we were on call, trying to look around. It was a couple minutes later, he suddenly said, "Oh shit," and saw some guy leaving out of the window on the side of my house and running into the trees. He said it looked like the same guy he saw before. I couldn't even speak for a minute, terrified of how right I was about my paranoid feeling of not being alone. When police made it, I stood outside with them while they did their whole investigation. My friend also came out and talked to them. It didn't lead to much, though, aside from the promise to search for the man and follow up if there's any leads. They did, however, compare it to a similar incident from a couple weeks ago in a nearby neighborhood, where a kid was also home alone and some guy was creeping around outside, eventually coming up to the window and trying to convince the kid to let him in. In both cases, though, it isn't really clear what he was plotting. Kidnapping is the obvious answer, but he didn't seem to have a car, so dragging a kid kicking and screaming out of a house didn't seem likely to me. I don't know what was going to happen that night, and I never found out, because the guy is still out there, probably still creeping around and stalking someone without them knowing it. I was on a road trip across the states to meet up with my family and a couple of friends on the West Coast. On the way there, I booked a cabin to stay at just for the night. Plan was to only be there for 10 to 12 hours. Basically just eat dinner, shower, and sleep. Then head back onto the road first thing in the morning. When I arrived, I'd been on the road for 9 hours already and was very tired. The cabin was a lot more isolated than I thought, though. It could have just looked that way because it was in the middle of the night and in the woods, but it definitely wasn't what I expected. I think I was expecting it to be part of a whole row or cluster of other cabins that people also rented out, but it wasn't. It just sat alone. I parked in the gravel in front of the cabin and headed inside. Oddly, the front door didn't match the rest of the cabin. It wasn't an issue by any means, but it was just very noticeable, and I thought it was a weird decision. It was a modern, heavy door, while the rest of the cabin was all wooden and old. Anyway, this cabin was just a single room, with a bed, kitchenette, couch, and TV all crammed into the small space. It had a very old-timey feel. I wasted no time getting dinner ready, eating, and then getting ready for bed. I was pretty tired, so I passed out really fast. But I think only an hour or so after I'd fallen asleep, I woke up. Not to a noise, but a feeling. I know it sounds crazy, but when I woke up, I just felt really uneasy for some reason. I sat up and just listened for a moment to make sure it wasn't anything I heard, but the cabin was silent. Still unsure, I peeked out the window next to me. I didn't expect to see anything, but when I looked out, I could immediately see something moving in the woods. It took me a few seconds to really tell what it was, but by the way the figure moved, I was pretty sure it was a person. What the hell were they doing out here? I'm not exaggerating when I say it was pitch black outside. The forest was dense, and no light from the moon or stars was coming down. I could only watch them for 30 seconds before they were completely out of view. I stayed by the window for a bit, waiting to see if they appeared again. But after 5 minutes, I laid back down. Tomorrow was going to be a long day of driving. I tried to close my eyes and drift back into sleep, but I was probably laying there for 40 minutes, still eyes closed and not being able to sleep, before I heard something outside the cabin. There wasn't enough time to even comprehend what it was before a knock came at the door. Again, this whole cabin was one room, so the door they were knocking on was literally just a couple feet from me, and there was nowhere else to hide or exit from. I jumped up from the bed. My head was spinning. I don't think I'd been that scared in my entire life. Then, a man's voice yelled from the other side of the door, "Hey, open up. Open the door now. I know you're in there. Open the fucking door." His voice was aggressive and angry, and only had me even more horrified. I didn't know whether to respond or what to do. They clearly knew I was inside. I mean, even my car was out front, practically giving it away. I got my phone and dialed 911. It took a minute for the call to go through. I think my phone had no service, so it was trying to use data, and it was just struggling. But when it got through, I got online with an operator who said an officer was on the way. The guy outside the cabin was still hitting the door. Honestly, I couldn't tell if he was just banging on the door or actively trying to break the door down. He never got in, though. After a minute or two, I heard him leave the porch. Then I heard glass shattering, which I knew was from my car. When cops pulled up, he wasn't there. There were some clear indicators that he ran back into the woods, but obviously they weren't just going to run in there and look for him, at least not in the middle of the night. But when the owner of the cabin was contacted, things got a little weird. He admitted that a previous resident had a similar incident, but they never contacted the police about it. Apparently, someone came knocking on the door in the middle of the night and was yelling at them. The next morning, after the one staying there had left, the owner found the door bashed open, like broken into with a sledgehammer or something. I guess the owner thought if he reported it, word would get out and nobody would want to stay there. So he kept it on the low and just replaced the door with something heavier and more sturdy. Really weird. I don't know how to feel about that. End of the day though, I was just glad to get out of there and go see my family and friends. Maybe I could have done more about it, but I just wanted it to be over with. What that man came to the cabin to do will be something I continue to think about likely for the rest of my life.
She has a wings on her head.